Good morning, and thank you again for joining us online to worship God together. It's always an honor to be able to bring a message from God's Word to you, and I'm looking forward to diving right in this morning. George has wrapped up an excellent series on being strong and courageous in our stance for Christ in this world as we wage war here on this earth to help establish His kingdom, just as Joshua and the Israelites did as they entered the Promised Land all those years ago. And he's going to be back again next week to launch a new series as we are approaching the 30-year anniversary of the Trace Church at the end of this month, which is pretty amazing. So I want to encourage you to join us for that series. And so this morning, what we're going to be doing is just kind of taking a break in between two series. The book of Psalms refers to it as Selah, a little rest or a break in between the series. And so I'm looking forward to take the opportunity in this break to just give you a little nugget of God's love for His people through a story found in Matthew chapter 17. So if you want to go ahead and turn your Bible there, that's pretty much where we're going to be this whole time, this whole lesson, and you can just kind of be there ready to read along with us. So before we dig in, though, I want to speak to the fact that if we really look at what the Bible speaks to us about, it's not really about the laws. Now, there are laws in the Bible, good laws, laws that were written by God Himself, but it's not about how we earn our way into heaven. It's about God's revelation of Himself to us in such a way that ultimately brings about our desire to have a relationship with Him in the same way He wants one with us. And so this relationship, it's not a relationship of a master and a slave, or even as God and man, like most world religions would establish, which is the idea that man must appease the God or gods to make his own life more tolerable on earth. It's not that type of relationship at all, so much as it is a relationship of a father to his child, a relationship where He loves us unconditionally, where His greatest joy is to hear us call out His name for the first time, to watch us take our first steps, to offer us security when we're afraid or comfort in hard times, to offer counsel to us as we navigate through this life. That's the kind of relationship we're talking about. And we all have different images of God as a father, though, and that's mainly because we usually base those images around our image of our own earthly father. It doesn't really do it justice, though, because some of us maybe never experienced a father figure in our lives. For others, our fathers ruled with an iron fist. For others, our fathers were there, but maybe really never showed an interest in our lives, and so on and so on. All of our earthly fathers have these gaps, these shortfalls that help us fail to realize or fully grasp God's love for us. And so, what God is trying to show us through the Bible is what kind of relationship that is. All right, it's difficult for us to actually identify that relationship. We can read the story of the prodigal son, where the father allows his son to go off and live a life that's filled with self-gratification and self-destruction, and how the father goes and stares out towards the road daily, longing for his son to return home. And when his son finally does return, the father runs to him, embraces him, throws a feast in his honor rather than punishing him for the dishonor that the son had shown towards the father. We can sing songs about how deep the Father's love for us, vast beyond all measure, but it's still difficult to wrap our minds around this type of relationship that God desires to have with us because of our limited perspective. And so this morning, I want to focus in on this short little interaction between Peter and Jesus in Matthew 17 to maybe see a little clearer how God views the father-child relationship. And so we're going to read Matthew 17, verses 24 through 27 together. Follow along with me as we read. When they came to Capernaum, those who collected the temple tax approached Peter and said, "Doesn't your teacher pay the temple tax?" "Yeah," he said. Then when he went into the house, Jesus spoke to him first. "What do you think, Simon? From whom do earthly kings collect tariffs or taxes? From their sons or from strangers?" "From strangers," he said. "Then the sons are free," Jesus told him. "But so we won't offend them. Go to the sea, cast in a fish hook, take the first fish that you catch, When you open its mouth, you'll find a coin. Take it and give it to them for me and you. Now, I know as a first read through, this doesn't seem to have anything at all to do with the type of relationship God desires to have with us. It's a conversation about taxes, and not just any tax, but a tax to the church. And so I want to just be clear, I am not in any way talking about your giving habits today, all right? So also, as unbelievable as it is, I'm not even going to spend any time really on a fish who happens to have a coin in its mouth of the exact amount needed to cover the tax either. Pretty miraculous situation, but that's not what I want to focus on. No, this interaction here is actually, to me, this incredibly intimate moment between Jesus and Peter. And I want to sort of flesh that out a little this morning. So Peter, I don't know if you know or not, he has this habit throughout his life of just open mouth, insert foot. And he does it over and over and over, from making Jesus prove it's him walking on the water by calling out to him and say, hey, you come on in. And then Peter gets in the water and then he sinks, to maybe where he slices a dude's ear off in the garden towards the end of Jesus' life, for Jesus to quickly take the ear, put it back on, and tell Jesus that we're not fighting like that right now, to making the bold statements that Peter made throughout his lifetime of there, especially at the end, I'm ready to die for you. I'm never going to leave you. And then immediately that same very night that he uttered those words, he denies even to know who Jesus is, not once, but 3 separate times. And so as you really dig into a character study of Peter, you see this rough around the edges fisherman who's all in on his belief of who Jesus says he is, but he needs a lot of work. He's a child that Jesus has to train. And honestly, most of the disciples here, the 12, probably were about teenage years, early 20s. And so Jesus has to train them. And this interaction is one of those training moments. Okay, so let me set the stage for you a little bit about what's going on. In the previous chapter, chapter 16, which takes place about a week prior to this temple tax conversation, Jesus has a conversation with his disciples about who everyone thinks he actually is. And they say, well, some folks are saying you're Elijah. Other folks are saying you're John the Baptist. And then, there's some others that say you're a prophet of some sort. And so Jesus then asks the question, he says, so who do you say that I am? And Peter's the first guy who steps up to answer, and he gives this bold confession of faith in who Jesus actually is in Matthew 16:16, saying, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Okay, pretty bold confession. Then 6 days go by, beginning of Matthew 17 opens up, and Jesus is taking Peter, James, and John on a hike up to the top of a mountain. It's just the 4 of them, all right? And while they're up there, take a look at what happens. Matthew 17, verses 2 through 9. He was transfigured in front of them. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as light. Suddenly Moses and Elijah appeared to them, talking with them. Then Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it's good for us to be here. If you want, I'll set up 3 shelters here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. When the disciples heard this, they fell face down and were terrified. And Jesus came up, he touched them and said, get up, don't be afraid. And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus commanded them, don't tell anyone about the vision until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. And so we have this incredible account of Revelation where Peter, who just confessed his belief in the fact that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, he witnesses Jesus literally transformed before his very eyes, where essentially what Jesus does here is he shows his true glory. His true glory is being revealed, and Peter sees the whole thing. He is shining bright. His clothes are white. His face is radiating light. He sees Elijah and Moses there talking with him. And it's at this point in Matthew's gospel that we find out that Peter has seen enough to know exactly who Jesus is and what he's capable of doing. And we put ourselves in his shoes, we're probably feeling pretty good. All right. You look at what you've seen and heard. You've seen the miracles that he's performed. You've seen this transfiguration, this transformation of Jesus showing his his true glory. And, if it's me, I'm thinking, ooh, I'm in a really good position because I have just partnered myself with probably one of the most, no, not probably, definitely the most powerful king this world has ever seen. And I imagine that's probably what Peter's thinking. And he's like, and I'm in the inner circle, right? Peter is probably thinking like you or I might be thinking of this is going to be awesome. Like he's on cloud nine. He's not worried about a thing anymore. But then they come off the mountain, and as soon as they do, Jesus is met by a man begging Jesus to heal his son because his disciples couldn't do it. And so Jesus heals the boy that his disciples should have been able to heal. It was a demon possession, and Jesus had already given them the authority to cast out demons, but they couldn't do it. And we find out that Jesus says it's because of a lack of faith to see it through. And so right after that interaction, Jesus immediately begins to tell his disciples about how he's going to be betrayed and ultimately killed, but will rise on the third day. And so this causes quite a bit of distress with the disciples, and they become super torn up about it. And so I just want you to just try and put yourself in Peter's shoes and think about what's going on in his mind as he is processing everything that's just taken place, everything that he's seen and heard, and he's thinking about the fact that he just witnessed Jesus in all of his glory, and now he's saying that he's going to be killed. That it's not adding up. And so that finally brings us to the temple tax situation. How in the world is this conversation about a temple tax showing us the kind of relationship that God wants with us? As I said earlier, the biblical story, it's about God's revelation of himself to us in such a way that ultimately brings about our desire to have a relationship with him. And it's in these chapters here that God has revealed himself to Peter through Jesus. Peter has seen Jesus in his glory on the mountaintop. He's heard the very voice of God, and in all its power, it literally struck fear in Peter. But it was in his moment of fear, in the glory of God and Jesus himself, that Jesus responds. And look at how he responds. He covers back up his glory to where he's no longer radiating light. He puts his human form back on, and then Jesus walks back down the mountain with Peter and explains to Peter that he's going to even allow himself to be killed. God's revelation of himself through Jesus is one of ultimate humility. Philippians 2, 6 through 8 expresses it this way. It says, Jesus, who, existing in the form of God, did not consider equality with God as something to be exploited. Instead, he emptied himself by assuming the form of a servant, taking on the likeness of humanity. And when he had come as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even to death on a cross. And so it's through Jesus we're able to see the relationship God desires to have with us. A relationship not where we have to attain his level, but where he is willing to come down to our level. And there are three things here that Jesus demonstrates in that interaction with Peter that I believe that can help us see this more clearly. Number one, Jesus is willing to talk. I imagine the style of conversation as one like that of Andy Taylor that he would have had with his son Opie on the Andy Griffith Show. It's in that show that Andy, he always seemed to be one step ahead of everyone else, but most of the time anyway, and including his son. And so there would be episodes where Opie would get into trouble or be struggling with a problem, and somehow Andy would already know about what was going on. And Opie would come through the door, whether it was at home or whether it was at his office, and Andy would set him down and start asking him questions he already knew the answer to. But what we as an audience knew was that Andy wanted to engage in a conversation with Opie to help him through his problem, whatever it may have been, to help him become a better person. And so I think this is exactly what's going on here. Peter has a conversation with one of the temple tax collectors about whether or not Jesus will pay the temple tax. And Peter tells him, yeah, sure, absolutely, he'll pay. Peter doesn't even pause to think for a second, all right? He just answers, yeah, absolutely. And Jesus, in this instance where Peter responds, he's nowhere around, and he's most likely back probably at Peter's house. Peter's from Capernaum, so it's likely that they were at Peter's house staying while they were there. And so that's likely where Jesus is. And so when Peter walks in the door of his house, I like to imagine Jesus is just sitting there at the table, and he looks up, he sees Peter come in, and he calls Peter over. He says, come on, have a seat. And Jesus speaks first, all right? And he just pops this thought-provoking question out of thin air, right? It's like almost as if this was a conversation that was taking place, but Peter wasn't there, and so Peter has walked in, so he wants to bring him into the conversation, all right? And Jesus says in verse 25, he says, "What do you think, Simon?" Which is Peter's real name. Peter is a nickname that Jesus gives him. "What do you think, Simon? From whom do earthly kings collect tariffs or taxes? From their sons or from strangers?" Now, as outsiders looking in, reading this, we know what conversation Peter just had. We also know what Peter has witnessed about Jesus and what he has claimed, that he is the Son of God. God, whose house to the Jews and to Peter is the temple. Okay, so imagine what's going through Peter's head right now concerning the question Jesus asked him as soon as he walks in the door, and then thinking back to what he just told the temple tax collector. Can you see it? Can you feel Peter starting to get a little squirmy in his seat? Maybe the blood is starting to rush into his head. He's starting to get like super guilty feeling. His palms are starting to sweat. It's another classic Peter moment of insert foot in mouth now, right? Peter has committed Jesus to a tax that Peter, after processing it, knows he should have never had to pay. And he's just now coming to terms with it. He's just now realizing it. But Jesus has the conversation. It's not harsh. He doesn't light into him and say, "Well, you're out of your mind if you think I'm paying for your stupid little mistake." No, it's a conversation that is done in a way to promote a better understanding of the true order of the way things should be. And so Peter answers, obviously, he gives the right answer. Kings collect taxes from strangers and not their sons. That doesn't make sense. And Jesus' response in verse 26 is, all right, so before we read his response, imagine this moment, okay? Jesus leans in. He maybe even puts his arm around Peter's shoulder or just puts his hand on his shoulder, the same way Andy would have done to Opie. And maybe even tilts his head down a little bit and makes that eye contact. He wants to look at him eye to eye. And he kind of smiles, a little crooked smile or something. Like I just really imagine Andy Griffith, this is the conversation. He's leaning in, eye to eye, makes that eye contact, smiles a little bit, and then he responds with this: "Then the sons are free." And this is the moment. Peter is like really guilty at this point. And I know Jesus realizes that too. He uses this opportunity to teach Peter an important lesson about who God is and what he's willing to do in the relationship with us, in that Jesus is willing to pay. Verse 27, Jesus says, "But so we don't offend them, go to the sea, cast in a fish hook, and take the first fish that you catch. When you open its mouth, you'll find a coin. Take it and give it to them for me." The fact that the Son of God leans into Peter here and essentially says, "Hey, don't worry about it. We're going to go ahead and we're going to pay this tax on my behalf. Not because I have to, but because I don't want to offend them over this. It's just not worth it." Jesus is sharing this important lesson, not just about the fact that he's willing to pay for a mistake that Peter made in judgment, but about not mishandling the freedom that we are given as sons and daughters of God. Galatians 5:13 says, "For you were called to be free, brothers and sisters. Only don't use this freedom as an opportunity for the flesh, but rather serve one another through love." Jesus, the Son of God, creator of heaven and earth, is taking this moment to explain to Peter the kind of love he has, not only for his disciples, but also those who don't really see eye to eye with him, which the religious leaders who would have been collecting those taxes most certainly did not. And then finally, Jesus shows that in this relationship, he is willing to provide. So I left off the last part of verse 27 the last time we read it. So I want to reread it again one more time all the way through, starting verse 27. But so we won't offend them, go to the sea, cast in a fish hook, take the first fish that you catch. When you open its mouth, you'll find a coin. Take it and give it to them for me and you. Jesus says, listen, I want you to first off think about the fact that I am the Son of God, the Messiah. You said it yourself, Peter. You've seen me in my glory on that mountain. I, more than anyone, should not be paying this tax for the upkeep of my Father's house. But because sometimes it's better to sacrifice pride for the sake of love, I'm going to pay the tax. And I'm going to settle the debt you've committed me to. But I'm also going to pay your debt as well. And just to help you remember it, so it really sinks in, Peter, I'm going to let you do what you love to do. I'm going to send you out fishing. And when you catch that first fish, you're going to find a coin, and it's going to cover us both. Isn't that a beautiful image? I love this quick little interaction with Jesus and Peter. I doubt it was longer than a 5-minute conversation. It probably took longer for Peter to tie the hook on the line and catch the fish than the conversation to take place. But it is a conversation for Peter only, between he and Jesus, a personal moment. And I think it's those little moments that God desires to have with us the most, where he can get down on our level, where he can look us eye to eye and show us how much he loves us with something so small. Maybe you've had moments like that you cherish in your relationship with God, moments that are entirely yours. Those moments are what this walk with God is all about, encountering his goodness, his grace, and his love. Not about presenting yourself blameless, because Peter certainly did not in this instance and many others. It's just about being in his presence and being willing to allow him to gently correct and lead into a deeper love for him. So if you've never experienced a moment like that with him, I would challenge you this week. Take some time. Just sit still in his word. Allow yourself the time to be in his presence. Because when we seek him, we will find him. That is a promise that we have been given. And when you do have one of those encounters with God, even just a taste, you will see that he is good.